Good evening. Welcome to Powell's. Thanks for coming out tonight. With no further ado, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Laura Meister-Smith-Gavin, who is on the board of Institute for Anarchist Studies, who co-published tonight's book along with AK Press. So once again, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Laura. She will introduce tonight's speaker.
That was so fast. Hi. Hey, I'm Laura. This is awesome, you guys. Look how many people are here to support amazing thinking and work. That's so exciting. I'm happy to see you, and it feels really good in here. We are super excited to share the latest book in the Anarchist Imagination series, which is one of the series that the Institute for Anarchist Studies publishes with AK Press. Do you all know AK Press? Yeah, they do great work. How many of you know the IAS? Yeah, woo, awesome. All right, well, if you don't, I'm going to take a quick second because there's some exciting work that happens. We publish a couple of different book series with AK. We also publish both online and print versions of our journal, Perspectives on Anarchist Theory. We host theory tracks at conferences. We host speakers through the Mutual Aid Speakers Bureau. And most importantly, we give grants to radical writers because our primary mission is that we want to support the theory that builds our movement to come from the folks that are doing the work themselves. So we seek to support people that are working outside of academia. We're 100% volunteer run. We have one staff person, and all of the work just comes from, support, material support from our friends and allies and from the people on the board, and from folks like Kevin. So, one of the things that makes that work so vital for me that has been going on, the IAS has been in effect for 21 years now, and I've been affiliated with it for 8, is the fact that we're supporting that kind of scholarship and like a really robust investigation in how we can make the theories of anarchism more complete, and more useful, and more total, and more relevant to ongoing movement struggles, and also support the people that are doing the active organizing on the ground. So Kevin is such a great example of this. He is a writer who manages to establish real intellectual rigor while staying plugged into the active struggles that people are engaged in their daily lives. And that could not be more apparent than with this latest book, Guerrillas of Desire. Kevin has worked for nearly 20 years in active solidarity with day labor and unhoused communities. He's been organizing against wage theft and housing injustice. He's a member of the Team Colors Collective, and he co-edited their volume, Uses of a Whirlwind, Movements and Contemporary Radical Currents in the United States. His work has also appeared in Life During Wartime, Resisting Counterinsurgency, which was edited by Christian Williams, Willmonger, and me on AK Press. He also appears in We Are Many. Oh my God, there's so many books with like the longest subtitles, you guys. Like, it's like :17 things. All right, We Are Many, Reflections on Movement Strategy from Occupation to Liberation, and Constituent Imagination, Militant Investigations, Collective Theorization, and elsewhere. So he's also an adjunct faculty in the Department of Geography at PSU and is a proud member of the PSU Faculty Association. So let's give him a really warm welcome. He's amazing.
Thank you. Let's see how well I'm going to do without tripping on this thing. How's everyone tonight? Good? It's nice and cool in here? Okay. Whew. I got some hometown jitters, so we'll see how this is going to go. I want to begin with some words from elusive anarchist author B. Traven. Supposedly, he has said, "I'm in fact no more important than the typesetter for my books, the man who works at the mill. No more important than the man that binds my books, and the woman who wraps them, and the scrub woman who cleans up the office." Well, besides the outdated gendered language here, I would certainly concur, because without the independent but still interconnected efforts of AK Press, of the Institute of Anarchist Studies, of Scott and Jeremy here at Powell's, and of course sponsorship by KBOO, Guerrillas of Desire would not be on the shelves, and I certainly would not be standing in front of you. But I also want to begin by acknowledging those in the room. I want to acknowledge those in this room and also all the other rooms that I'll be speaking at in the next couple of months. So I just came from Seattle last weekend. I did Olympia on Saturday, and then in a couple of weeks I'll be heading out to the Northeast to do similar book talks to similar rooms. And in these rooms, I'm going to be speaking to dear family members. partners, lovers, comrades, political associates, and many, many others. And part of the reason I want to acknowledge that is this is part of collective life, right? And there are specific people that are in this particular room that have had a huge influence on me intellectually and personally. So Doc, really I'm going to embarrass a couple of you, so get ready. For my late teens and early 20s, probably no one else was as much of a moral compass for me in regards to how to treat other people and how to be in relationships. The amazing artist who did the artwork for the book, No Monzo, is here. Stephen Q, who did a fantastic article for Street Roots, and if you've not seen it, it's in this week's issue.
You can buy it outside.
You can buy it outside. Don't leave just yet, but I'll be quick so you still can. One of my dearest, oldest friends, Vegan Phil, is standing in the back, right? Someone I've known for 20 years, that I've struggled with, that I've participated in collective action with. And part of the reason to talk about this is that while what I just said is unidirectional, right? It's these individuals that have been part of my life. I want folks to think about the multitudinous relationships that exist between folks in this room, right? And not just in this room, but extend beyond this room. Because that is collective life. And I'm interested in collective life for a number of reasons. And I'm going to focus in on a particular aspect of collective life, right? And I'm interested because this is where our friends and enemies are. And there are friends and enemies in the room, and who's a friend and who's an enemy will certainly be clarified by the time we get to question and answer, right? But this aspect of collective life is in fact the substance, the materiality, the affects and emotions, and the relationships that we produce and reproduce in our society. Collective life, as Marx would say, is what capitalism is vampiric off of. It is these kind of relationships, that surplus that we produce among ourselves and in our everyday lives as we reproduce each other, as we participate in forms of work, we participate in forms of labor. And in fact, what capital does is it sucks the life out of that collective life, right? And collective life as a subject for revolutionary thinkers and organizing, all those kind of things, have come under different rubrics, have been phrased in different ways. So for instance, those familiar with the idea of the commons, or commoning, that is producing the commons themselves. Autonomists would call this self-activity or self-valorization. Anarchists might refer to this as mutual aid. And different revolutionary traditions have looked at collective life and come up with different phrasing, different ways of trying to understand how this functions. And what I want to do is not just try to understand how collective life functions, but also try to understand why collective life is important for revolutionary struggle, for upheaval, for all kinds of other things. So I'm going to do a quick reading from the book, and then I'm going to speak a little bit more about specific examples of collective life and everyday resistance. So I'm going to try to do this with a mic in one hand and a book in another. Two aspects of human life impressed me most during the journeys I made in my youth across suburban Long Island and in the green mountains of Vermont. One was the ingenious methods of survival, authentic communication, daring acts of kind-heartedness and mutuality, and an embedded, productive sense of commonality that confronted untold deficiencies in the material needs of existence. The other was that ongoing, seemingly endless struggle to improve the human condition, reorganization of ecological and spatial sensibilities, and reordering of time toward an ordinary pace of life, an immense output of creativity and ideas in the most inhospitable of locales with the most restrictive of conditions. The first aspect articulates mutual aid, the second a degree of refusal. Being productive in common is where these excursions meet. As I began to investigate this nexus, other practices, methods of organization, and forms of life popped out of the shadows like lightning bugs at dusk. Peter Kropotkin's Mutual Aid carries the subtitle, A Factor of Evolution. Throughout Mutual Aid, Kropotkin corrects the social Darwinian misconception that competition defined human evolution. Then, he humbly offers mutual aid as a factor in the unfolding of life on the planet, resulting in human societies. Everyday resistance is a factor in revolutionary struggle, not the sole factor. Answering how everyday resistance, that is refusals of work and practices of mutual aid, is a factor in revolution is the task of this book. Guerrillas of Desire offers a contentious hypothesis, and this is somewhat polemical. The fundamental assumption underlying left and radical organizing, including many strains of anarchism, is wrong. I do not mean organizationally dishonest, ideologically inappropriate, or immoral. I mean empirically incorrect. Historical and current strategies on the left and in radical movements are predicated on the assumption that working class and poor peoples are unorganized and not resisting. Hence, the role of the activist, organizer, and insurrectionist is to activate, organize, and educate, and disengage population through various initiatives. Illustrating that everyday resistance is a factor in revolution and a form of politics, maintaining that its effects on overt rebellion and crises are measurable requires a reversal of this assumption. Working class and poor peoples, as slaves, peasants, and workers in the industrial and social factory, are already organized and are already resisting. Describing the myriad forms of everyday resistance under slavery, in peasant politics, and throughout the industrial and social factory is an immense undertaking. The transatlantic slave trade, peasant politics, and the industrial factory emerged during an era marked by the advent of capitalism and the modern nation state, that is, the period between the 14th century and the present. This book limits its focus to the refusal of work as it appears in everyday life and how this relates to and intersects with overt rebellions against work. Herein, I address the revolt against work, examine self-activity and mutual aid, and consider how to apply a taxonomy of struggle to the historical record as a sense-making machine to understand these phenomena. Refusals by Guerrillas of Desire take place outside the normal surveillance mechanisms of capitalism in the state, and relationships based on mutual aid are produced, often in temporary space. These practices are intended to be illegible to the state, and so they should remain at all costs. Guerrillas of Desire is an historical work for this reason, as there is little concern that guilty parties, slaves, peasants, and industrial workers long dead, would suffer state repression as a result of exposure here. While I seek to provide tools for contemporary struggle, mechanisms for uncovering and amplifying everyday resistance practices will have to be developed in situ. They'll have to be developed in the actual context where these things are occurring. So, if you don't mind, we're going to go a little metaphorical for a moment. Guerrilla attacks take place in valleys populated by tax collectors, managers, and bureaucrats. The guerrillas make excursions from the hills and the liberated territories populated by commoners whose ongoing acts of resistance produce the commons. Typically, an ambush is followed by a tactical retreat, and guerrillas use stolen goods in storehouse raids to meet the needs of the population by addressing needs that the state and capital have not met and have refused to address. Guerrillas develop a sense of solidarity and interdependence with the people. If the guerrillas can create a gravitational pull within a community, tugging the population further away from state and capital, the general population will provide cover for guerrilla actions. The solidarity, communication networks, and mutual aid that already exist within the general population are given to guerrillas and used by them to carry out actions over a wider area. With increased support comes an increased chance of operational success and often the ability to avoid capture. Skirmishes erupt as guerrillas continue to enter and then flee the valleys for the relative safety of the hills. Raids on armories, sabotage of the machinery of production, arson of the slave masters or bureaucrats' homes become part of the assembled counter-narratives and then counter-institutions. These are complementary practices chosen contextually to address the immediate needs and desires of guerrilla forces. This is the model anyway. However, models in theory should not be substituted for the complexities of actual reality. So I want to provide some examples of what I'm talking about here, right, to kind of concretize this a bit. But I think I should define everyday resistance before moving on. Everyday resistance is part of this larger framework of collective life that I've been speaking about. It's a particular set of practices within collective life, and they're only possible because of this collective life taking place. And by everyday resistance, I mean forms of refusal against work that are informal, that are somewhat quote-unquote unorganized, that are outside these regular surveillance mechanisms. And then what I want to do is counter everyday practices with more overt organizing and overt rebellion, even a clandestine organization, a guerrilla army, for instance, is in declaration of a direct struggle against the state, right? That's an overt struggle, even if it's quote unquote clandestine. Everyday resistance practices, on the other hand, try to avoid this direct confrontation in any way possible in order to maintain both the security of those involved in these practices and also hopefully their operational success, right? And I'm also interested in the revolt against work and the revolt against the imposition of work. So what is that kind of terminology, right? So some of you, I'm sure, have heard of the revolt against work or the imposition of work and this kind of terminology, but I want to be pretty clear about what I'm speaking about. So I mean the imposition on individuals on the job. You go to work for 8 hours, you're expected to do X, Y, and Z in that work process, right? If you don't, you get fired, they hire somebody else. But I also mean the imposition of work on a population, of which the absence of work itself is also an imposition, right? So if you don't work, what happens? You don't get wages. And what happens then? Well, then you can't pay rent, you can't buy food, you can't actually exist. There's no other way to subsist in a capitalist society besides work. So what happens when there isn't work? What happens when particular racialized or gendered bodies are not given access to wage work? And I'm not just interested in waged work, in the work, oh, okay. I hope that's a ladybug, because that would be good luck. I think it's a fly. I'm interested in not just these forms of wage work, right, under slavery, in peasant societies, and in the industrial and social factory. I'm also interested in unwaged work. Because arguably the most important commodity for capitalism is labor power, to use Marx's apt phrase. And what he means is the worker's ability to work. You're not hired as a human being to go to work. Your capacity to work is what's being hired out, right? That's what you're renting out. That's what you're lending out for a wage. And the reproduction of that is predominantly done by women and gender nonconforming peoples without a wage. It's called housework. And at least according to the most recent data that I looked at the Bureau of Labor Statistics website today, most of that work, and I don't mean 51%, 52%, I mean 70%, 80%, 90% of that unwaged work that's being performed in our society is still being done by women and gender nonconforming folks after 40 years of feminist struggle, right? Without that work, nobody goes to quote unquote wage work. Hence, it's a very important commodity for capitalism. Without unwaged work, there isn't labor power. Without labor power, there aren't commodities, right? There aren't markets. There aren't things to be sold because nothing is being produced without that particular commodity. So I'm interested in the revolt against work in these particular ways under slave societies, in peasant societies, in the industrial and social factory, but also in these other ways, which usually are not acknowledged as work itself. And with this comes an expanded definition of the working class, right? The working class is all those who work is imposed upon as an individual or as a population, but also all those who are refusing this imposition of work. And the class becomes itself by this refusal. It becomes something else and capitalism desires it to be, that this collective life can expand upon, can be in surplus of, can escape through this refusal of work. So, I think I need to give you some pretty concrete examples of what this refusal looks like and what these everyday resistances look like, right? So I'm going to give you 3 quick stories, then I'm going to talk a bit about organizing, we're going to wrap up with a chant, and then we'll do some question and answer. Sound good? Okay, first story. Who has heard of Nat Turner? Hands up, right? We all learned about Nat Turner in history class. Well, we should have all. Yeah, let's be honest. We all should have heard about Nat Turner in history class.
Not in the South.
Not in the South, but yes. In Long Island, where I grew up, we heard about Nat Turner. Hopefully, if you took a class in history at Portland State, you'd hear about Nat Turner, et cetera, et cetera. Nat Turner is important for this story for a number of reasons. Nat Turner led the largest slave rebellion, both in numbers of slaves and actual damage to the slaveocracy in American history. This took place in August of 1831. After the rebellion was suppressed, he avoided capture by running away and hiding in the woods for 2 months. And then, upon capture, he gave his confessions to a friend of his. And I want to read specifically from these confessions. So, Nat Turner himself says about this time, and speaking about the time that he's coming into consciousness as a slave and as a rebel and someone who needs to resist the slaveocracy. He says, "About this time, I was placed under an overseer, for whom I ran away. And after remaining in the woods for 30 days, I returned, to the astonishment of the Negroes on the plantation, who thought I had made my escape to some other part of the country, as my father had done before. So, directly from his mouth to someone's pen, as my father had done before, that he had run away. He actually didn't just run away, because you don't just run away from the slave plantation. When you run away, you need access to goods and to services. You need to know where safe places are. And none of those things take place without this collective life and this collective refusal and resistance that's taking place on the plantation. So Nat Turner didn't one day wake up and say, hey, let's go get a whole bunch of guns and overthrow the slave system. He took baby steps. He took numerous kinds of actions leading up to that kind of rebellion. And that included breaking tools, stealing things, passing food onto other slaves he wasn't supposed to. He had a familial history of doing this. His father had done this before him, right? And the reason I mention this story is I want to point out the relationship between everyday and overt resistance, because that exists today in all forms of rebellion, right? That in fact, these smaller, tiny acts accumulate. They accumulated in Nat Turner's mind, in his actual experiences, and then he decided to take armed action against the state. This was no leap that one day some union bureaucrat or party apparatchik or smart-ass revolutionary showed up and said, hey, Nat Turner, you know it would be a really good idea getting some guns and fighting the slave system. He didn't need that. He came to his own consciousness through these kind of acts, right? And there's a direct relationship in all forms of overt rebellion with everyday resistance. And I want to point attention to that. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that we know Nat Turner's name. Can anyone name another slave rebel leader? And don't say John Brown.
Nanny.
There's a few others, right?
Denmark.
Basic. Thank you. Tubman. But in fact, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of other slaves in the United States, or in the United States under the slaveocracy, and then of course in this entire continent, historically, who broke tools, who ran away, who stole things, who slit the master's throat as they slept in their bed, right? All these acts of resistance were taking place. We know Nat Turner's name, but unfortunately we don't know the thousands and thousands of other names. And that's going to be true of every form of everyday resistance that I point to. So, second story, and this comes from Southeast Asia in the 1970s. The hill country is referred to as Zambia by James Scott and other scholars, right? These are the hill countries outside of the state's control, out of the state's surveillance mechanisms, et cetera, et cetera. These are people who've fled the state in order to have their own lives, to create other kinds of agricultural systems, et cetera, right? So I want you to picture Southeast Asia, late 1970s, this American radical scholar shows up there and he starts looking for formal peasant organizations. He looks for peasant unions, he looks for political parties, he looks for all these things and finds nothing, right? Doesn't find any formalized political institution. And he says to himself, how in fact is resistance taking place? What is taking place so these people can survive in the hill country and resist state encroachment? What is taking place so these people can in fact maintain their own ways of life and cultural practices outside of the state? And what he finds is these everyday practices. And he finds this new labor-saving technology that's being implemented on these peasant communities. The combine harvester does the work of 1,000 peasants, right? Well, it's an exaggeration. A couple dozen peasants, a couple hundred peasants. So the peasants immediately realize that this new piece of machinery that's labor-saving technology is not there to make their lives better or to be utilized so that their time can be then used for other things. They realize that this piece of machinery is there for their immiseration. Because if you need 100 slaves, if you need 100 peasants and now you need 10 peasants to run this machinery, in fact, all those other individuals are thrown out of work. They don't have access to wages. If you don't have access to wages, of course, in a capitalist society, you don't have access to all kinds of other mechanisms and ways of survival. So even with these somewhat independent communities, they couldn't survive with the implementation of this kind of machinery in the fields, right? So what started happening? They didn't organize a peasant union, they didn't organize a political party, they didn't organize an overt rebellion. They decided to put sugar in the gas tank and break the windshield and set them ablaze, right? So think again, Southeast Asia, late 1970s. think the level of risk that people were taking to do this to combine harvesters. Because this is immediately after Vietnam. And these individuals knew they were not going to be rounded up or arrested or brought in front of a judge. They were going to be shot. They were going to be murdered. And if they were going to take that kind of risk, they had to know that their buddy down the street was not going to turn them in, right? So these kinds of acts of everyday resistance require immense levels of solidarity, of mutual aid, and communication. And these are 3 taxonomical categories that actually exist throughout all of everyday resistance practices, those historically and those today. Because unless you know that your buddy has your back, and unless you know that in fact doing this kind of act is going to further the struggle that you want to participate in, that you want to be engaged in, that's going to maintain your way of life, unless you know that, you're not going to take a risk, right? So remember those 3 categories: solidarity, communication, mutual aid. Those things are fundamental requirements for collective life, fundamental requirements for everyday resistance practices to take place. So let me move on to a final and personal example. Let's call this person Frank. I worked in a metal fabrication facility here in Portland from 2007, 2008 until 2012. It was about 400 guys on the factory floor. It was only men, they only hired men. About half were felons and former felons. And the reason for that is the boss was a former felon. He thought, hey, great, let's give former felons work. It also meant that he could exploit them and pay them low wages, and they couldn't unionize because if he threw them out of work, it would create all kinds of problems with their parole systems, right? And there was this guy, Frank, and Frank could not get to work on time. Frank never showed up on time, ever. And we knew that if Frank didn't show up on time, eventually he'd get written up, and then he'd get written up enough times, and then he'd get fired, and then he wouldn't be able to pay his rent, and he wouldn't be able to support his daughter, and he wouldn't be able to actually finish his parole. So what happened was I and others decided to just punch Frank in. I grabbed my time card, I grabbed Frank's time card, boop, double punch. And then the other guy in the office punched Frank in. And his buddies on the factory floor punched Frank in. And in fact, these kind of actions were constantly taking place, not just in that kind of environment, but in other quote unquote factories, right? At Starbucks, at social services, in welfare offices, right? These kind of counter-planning strategies in order to make sure this person maintains their job, you get more services, you have more access to the means of subsistence and survival. And in fact, I'm not the only one who's identified this kind of practice, and I'm sure there's plenty of you here who participated in said practices. But in the 1940s, 3 scholars and militants identified these kind of practices. Trinidadian Marxist C.L.R. James, Grace Lee Boggs, who's a Chinese-American luminary, and then a French militant by the name of Cornelius Castoriadis. And they reflected, this is their words, in one department of a certain plant in the United States, there is a worker who's physically incapable of carrying out his duties. But he is a man with a wife and children, and his condition is due to previous strain of his work in the plant. The workers in that department have organized their work so that for nearly 10 years, he has practically nothing to do. They have defined all efforts of the foreman and supervisor to discharge him, threatening to throw the whole plant into disorder if any steps are taken to dismiss him. This is the socialist society, right? This is the emergence of a new society. In these actual acts of mutuality, of solidarity, of resistance against these impositions of work, both on a collective level and those imposed on an individual level, right? And I don't want to come across as a class centrist or a workerist, but in fact, not only are these kind of resistances taking place in the factory, they're taking place in the home. They're taking place in regards to care work, taking place in regards to where there's an absence of work. They look different because of the forms of work that exist in these other spaces. But when we get to question and answer, we'll spend some time talking about this as well. But also, this is not the only form, this counterplanning is not the only form of everyday resistance to the imposition of work. There are others. Theft, sabotage, feigning illness. I mean, how many of us have called in sick when we were not sick? A whole lot of us, right? Suicide, slowdowns and strikes, counterplanning, squatting, exodus, arson, and leading up even to murder, right? There is an argument that there's very little difference between stabbing the overseer in their sleep and slitting the throat of an abusive husband as he sleeps on the couch, right? This is the refusal of forms of work and abuse and violence. They're constantly taking place over the 500 years of capitalism that I have moved through very, very quickly. So, why does any of this matter? Why is any of this important or interesting, right? I would argue that this is important for organizing in contemporary struggle. Not only because it's currently taking place, but also this is where overt rebellions emerge out of. So I want to go through that taxonomy of struggle again, right? We have these counter communities, this collective life that requires solidarity, mutual aid, and communication to take place. And then we have all these other forms of everyday resistance: theft, sabotage, counterplanning, etc., etc. And what this shows is that, in fact, over the last 500 years of capitalism and the state, there's an ongoing generalized revolt against work. We live in a society that honors work, thinks that work is so important, et cetera, et cetera. Why are so many of us, even when we're like, we love going to work, still taking longer breaks, stealing from work, right? Refusing these kind of impositions, coming up with other ways and means of survival so that we don't have to work as much, which many of us do in collective homes and other kind of mechanisms, right? But I'm interested in what this means for politics and what this means for organizing, because this is not just some kind of historical fluke or some interesting footnote, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to read a bit from the book on organizing. In perusing organizing manuals from Labor Notes, the War Resisters League, Service Employee International Union, and the Industrial Workers of the World, and many other organizations, it is remarkable how nearly none of them answer a simple question: where do organizers and organizations come from? Nearly all begin and continue, as the War Resisters League manual does, with the first chapter serving to provide an ideological justification for the organization's politics, only to be trailed by organizing a local group as the second chapter. The Labor Notes manual, which for those who are not familiar is arguably the Bible of left labor, the Labor Notes manual, a troublemaker's handbook, starts by suggesting that organizers initiate organizing by asking questions and listening to answers. Well, fair enough, right? This is then followed by a guide to mapping one's workplace. And this is a little shocking. It troubles me. Only 52 words in the handbook are dedicated to finding the natural leaders. In the leading left labor organizing manual, and I found nothing on this in the other manuals, only 52 words are dedicated to finding natural leaders. Well, anyone who's done salting, who's done organizing of any kind, realizes that when you're doing community organizing, you want to find that person who sits out on their porch, right? Who people go to with their personal problems, who come and speak about neighborhood issues and neighborhood problems. Hey, we need a stop sign at the end of the corner. Well, you go speak to her first, right? That person sitting out on that porch, who has that density of relationships, who has that node in collective life that's really important. Well, then why don't our manuals talk about this? It gets worse. Far, far worse. In Eric Mann's Playbook for Progressives, 16 Qualities of a Successful Organizer, part 1 is titled The Job Description, and subsequent chapters are titled The Foot Soldier, The Evangelist, The Recruiter, and The Group Builder. These titles suggest that organizers are born fully formed. Nonprofits and business unions often hire organizers directly out of college instead of from the communities and shop floors where they'll be operating. So Mann's job titles, Foot Soldier, Evangelist, Recruiter, Group Builder, are apropos. Each of these manuals continue by describing coalition building, working with different fully formed constituencies, mounting media strategies. Rarely is there a section on developing conversations and dialogues. None address how to inquire into existing modes of informal organizing or methods of survival in any substantive manner. None. I looked through every anarchist manual I could find. Folks have probably heard of Anti-Mass Organizing for Collectives, which was a popular pamphlet 10, 15 years ago for the anti-globalization movement. Everyone I knew read it, right? Nothing. Not even mentioned. Not even a suggestion that we should maybe inquire into our communities, that we don't know everything. So there's an approach not yet described that I will refer to as organizations all the way down. What are the integral elements of an organization? What are its precursors? Who told the hallowed stories that predate its formation? What experiences and encounters has the organizer emerged from? Where have these been recorded? And how can those of us acting in common amplify, circulate, and propagate these experiences and expressions? What are the constituent elements, forces, relationships, materials, needs, and desires that came together and allowed this organization to emerge? A response to these queries would require militants to investigate the constituent elements, forces, relationships, materials, needs, and desires that could emerge and are in fact emerging. Becoming attuned to the taxonomy of struggle, to everyday resistance in this manner, will require a new type of organizer. Organizers to come will develop out of personal experiences marked by the refusal of work and practices of mutual aid. They will use analyses of the rich and substantive history of revolutionary movements, in addition to staging encounters with one another that will produce, circulate, and accumulate knowledge. These organizers will always be growing, always becoming facilitators, ethnographers, inventors of culture and custom, and coordinators of collective life. Community dialogues are just one method of uncovering everyday resistance. To this we can add assemblies, surveys, inquiries, engaged public performances, and other means. It is from these processes that the principles that define a new society will emerge. Finally, the role of the organizers is to further the revolutionary becoming of those whom they engage. I'm not suggesting that relationships happen naturally, spontaneously, or by simply following a whim. Encounter is an intensive and inventive process, and one does not simply conclude that process. Just as we do not stop learning during the course of our lives, organizers do not earn their designation by reading a manual, and militants do not become revolutionary by bestowing that label upon themselves. Similarly, there is no difference between organizers to come and guerrillas of desire. The organizer and the guerrilla are points on a continuum. The role of this new type of organizer is defined by one's inquiry into everyday resistance. The organizer's task is to assist with the emergence and growth of this resistance, to amplify and circulate its struggles and the knowledge these struggles produce. This is our task. And in the process we, quote, recognize the new society, align ourselves with it, and record the facts of its existence, end quote. In this sense, the organizer will be attentive toward addressing needs, such as constructing survival pending revolution programs, but also desires to learn, to commune, and to be productive. "52 words, right? 52 words in all these manuals about everyday resistance. And I would claim, empirically, I can show this is the primary factor in both overt organizing, overt rebellion, and arguably the crisis against capitalism that has emerged periodically over its last 500-year history. But also I want to say a little bit more, right? We have this dichotomy in radical movements and in the left between spontaneity and organization, right? Things are too spontaneous, things are too organized, and there's all kinds of ideological reasons why you might justify one or the other. And I think this dichotomy is totally false. I think this dichotomy is totally false because different kinds of initiatives require different levels of organization and spontaneity, right? And I make this claim for a number of reasons. The first is, you don't need to be too organized to create a clandestine cell for a single action, right? You don't need nonprofit status, you don't need a website, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you do if you're going to open a community bookstore or a social center, because I was involved in one 20 years ago, and I've heard about dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of info shops and community centers that have opened since. And a group gets together, they have their collective, they have a meeting, and they're like, let's go open a community space. They didn't ask anyone if they needed a community space in that particular neighborhood, but they did it anyway. And they show up, and one person signs their name to the lease for 5 years. And then, of course, this place closes in 6 months, right? Because there was this idea that we build it and people will come. Well, we build it and nobody came. And we continue to build things and no one comes to it. And arguably, that's because there isn't that level of self-activity, of mutual aid, of this collective life throwing through this kind of project or this kind of place. those projects are successful when they're married to and when they amplify and circulate and further collective life, right? When those spaces are needed because that kind of collective life is at a surplus and will not function just out there generally in the world itself, in collective houses, in private spaces, et cetera, et cetera. I also say this because, as mentioned in my introduction, I'm a member of a labor union. And I'm sure as many of you, if not all of you know, we're at arguably the lowest level of unionization rate for the workforce since the working class emerged. And these organizations, how often are these dead bureaucracies not bringing in this self-activity and this collective life, right? So I'm not going to mention the union, I'm not going to mention who told me the story, but I'm going to give you a quick example. There was a nonprofit project here in Portland that decided to, there's a union here in Portland that decided to address housing. And as we all know, housing is a crisis, and at a crisis level here in town. And this union decided to fund a nonprofit organization to go out there and organize around housing. And it was quite successful. Defended homes. It brought this issue on both local and even a national level. It engaged people at forums and all kinds of activities. But what didn't happen is people didn't join the union. They didn't sign up. Membership didn't explode in this particular union, so after a few years, they cut funding and threw money at something else. See what might stick. How many working class and poor people don't support unions because they don't trust them? Because they don't see how they actually affect their lives, right? So at this particular moment, as it turned out, this union discovered a wellspring of self-activity, huge excitement around issues of housing, defending housing, et cetera, right? But because it didn't meet its immediate organizational need, they cut it off and stopped. And we see this all the time. I'm sure many of you who do organizing or in the labor movement have seen this over and over and over again. How many times have we been involved in projects where you're like, nobody's coming. Nobody's interested in what we're doing. Where are all the people for this really important issue that I think is the most important thing in the world? Well, we never bothered to ask. We never bothered to coordinate that kind of activity that might flow into the organizations we're involved in. What happens if this housing struggle actually took off? Passed some important legislation, right? Defended people's homes from being evicted, et cetera, et cetera. So I want us to think about how this spontaneity organization then can be articulated in different ways. And what I mean by that is, how is that articulated as a medicine and not a poison? So the original difference between medicine and poison was dosage. How much spontaneity do we need and how much organization do we need in the initiatives and the tasks that we want to carry out in order to further collective life and improve the quality of all of our lives, not just here in Portland, but across the planet, right? As I said in my introduction, everyday resistance is a factor in revolutionary struggle. It's an A factor in larger crises of capitalism in the state. It might not even be the factor, or arguably the most important factor. So I want us to keep that in mind. And the reason I want us to keep that in mind is that for every resistor, there's also a bootlegger, right? And sometimes that's the same person. And that was probably me last week when I overslept during my break and then rushed over to the boss and was like, what do we need to do? How do we get this done real quick, right? Because these are complex relationships. The way people intersect and actually refuse work, the way that people produce collective life is immensely complex. And it's not the only factor for consideration because, in fact, we cannot forget all these other intersectionality questions. During World War II, unionized workers in Detroit signed no strike pledges. They said, we will not strike. As long as the war is going on, we refuse to strike, we support the war effort. Well, as it turned out, they struck a lot, all the time, against the union and against the no strike pledge for higher wages, because they could not afford to live with inflation and various other things that were going on during the wartime period, right? And that's exciting, that these patriotic white male workers were striking against these pledges which they had signed in order to improve their conditions and the conditions of their families. But also, they didn't just strike for higher wages. Sometimes they struck against the inclusion of black workers and women in the factory. So everyday resistance, this kind of wildcat strike is important, but it's not the only factor that we can pay attention to. There's all these other factors that we do not want to forget about and make sure that we consider. So, I think it's time to wrap up. And I want to leave you with a couple of things. First is, how do we read these struggles? How do we read this collective life? How do we read the struggles that are taking place in everyday life? How do we read these everyday resistance practices that I've pointed to and I argue don't just exist historically, but exist in the contemporary? And I want us to search, dig if necessary, until you find guerrillas of desire, historically and today, in concentration camps, prisons, kitchens, brothels, slave quarters, hillside peasant abodes, factory rooms, and in rubble. So I told you we're going to end with a chant, right? I'm going to say it first. I'm sure a whole bunch of you know this already. I tried this in Seattle, I did this in Olympia, and it seemed to work there. So, come on. You gotta do it right. I'm going to read it, and then I want you to say it with me the second time up. I'm going to read a concluding passage from the book. We're going to say the chant slow one last time, and then we're going to wrap up. Does that sound good? Okay. The boss makes $1, I make a dime. That's why I poop on company time. Say it with me. I make $1. Can we edit that part out? Let's try that again. Woo! That's hot. Out there. The boss makes $1, I make a dime. That's why I poop on company time. It is those who inhabit the small, nearly imperceptible moments who are the harbingers of refusal and resistance, rebellion and possible revolution. Thus, the new society exists in the refusal of work and the embrace of mutual aid and working class self-activity. A new society begins, in part, in everyday resistance. Nice and slow. The boss makes $1, I make a dime. That's why I poop on company time. Thanks.